Here is an example of how a small group reading lesson could look and how this format can be used in order to support students with learning disabilities who struggle with reading, specifically decoding skills. So this format is taken from Jan Richardson's book, The Next Step Forward in Guided Reading. And obviously, this format is flexible. So if you don't get to every single part of this guided reading lesson every single time, that's okay. Especially our friends who need more support with decoding, they may need more time in the phonics word study portion of this small group reading lesson, and that would be completely appropriate to do instead of doing every single part. So we always start with sight word review, and it's really important that students are practicing writing the sight words that they are learning in class. So usually this sight word review takes about 1 to 2 minutes, and I have the students write a couple different sight words on whiteboards, and then I record in my data binder what words they are correctly spelling, what words they need more support with, and then that will help me know what I need to support them with later in the lesson. So after our sight word review, on day 1 of guided reading, so guided reading for early levels, so like first grade, is split into 2 days. So on day 1, after sight word review, I'm going to introduce a new book. I will choose a book for my group to read. This group will be a group of 3 to 5 students. For students with learning disabilities, the smaller, the better. 3 would probably be a good number. But my 3 to 5 students will be around the same level of reading, and I'm going to choose a book at their instructional level, a book that is not too easy. They couldn't read it all on their own, but it's not so difficult that it's frustrational. Kind of right in that sweet spot in their zone of proximal development where they need help with a few words in the book. They need teacher support to successfully complete it, but it is not frustrating. So, for example, I might have this book, Chocolate Chip Hippo, and I would introduce the book to my students. We would make predictions. We would look at some key words. I would pick out key phrases or key words from the book that I think that they may need extra support with. And then we would read the book. Each student will read the book to themselves, whisper reading. So round robin reading is not the most effective way, especially for students with learning disabilities, to read because it promotes anxiety. It doesn't promote students being engaged 100% of the time. So I have my students whisper read to themselves, and then I gently tap in and will read with them for a page or two, maybe make a few comments, and then I will go to the next friend. So in this way, they are reading at their own pace, they're reading at their own speed, and there's no pressure to read out loud in front of a group the first time reading the book. If a child finishes early, they can flip the book over and start rereading it. After we read the book with some prompting, then we're going to discuss some comprehension questions, really basic comprehension questions, just to make sure that they understood the gist of the story. At this point, then, after we kind of have discussed what happened in the story, I will teach them a new sight word. So this could be a word that they either had difficulty with at the beginning of the guided reading lesson, or it could be a word that they have not learned yet as a sight word. For example, I might teach the word know with a K, like I know something. I use magnet letters as much as I possibly can, especially students with learning disabilities. This extra concrete is good for them. So I would show my students the word, and then I would have them make the word themselves with magnet letters. And then I might play a few different games with them. I might play alphabet soup, where we mix the word up, and then they have to put it back together. I might play missing letter, where the students close their eyes, and I would take a letter, and they would open their eyes and have to tell me what letter I took. Okay, so just really getting my students familiar with this word We would use it in sentences, talk about what it means. This is going to be our new sight word. Now, ideally, this word would be in the book that we just read. However, sometimes those connections aren't possible, but ideally I want to try to incorporate sight words that are in the text that we are reading. After I teach a new sight word, the last part of our guided reading lesson is going to be a word study activity. And this is going to be crucial for our students with reading challenges. So like I said before, this part of the lesson, you can use your discretion. It might need to come first. It might need to be extended into another lesson. And I would take whatever phonics concept that those students are at. So a student reading this book, Chocolate Chippo Hippo, is a little bit higher. This is probably mid-level first grade, or it could be end of first grade. And so I might look through this and I might say, okay, we are going to study this double O, right? Like in the word cookie, in the word, I would find words through here that have that. Or I could say, all right, we are going to study our digraphs. So we are going to study the ch sound. Now, during this time is when I would incorporate whatever phonics curriculum we are using. So our school uses Orton Gillingham for students who struggle with reading. So I might incorporate some of their materials. I might incorporate some materials that I have on my own. And we would do word sorts. We would work on the sound, writing, and reading different words with that phonics skill. And again, that phonics skill is going to be different from group to group depending on what they need or depending on what we're learning as a class. So day one looks like sight word review, introducing a new book, reading that book, the students on their own reading it, with me there supporting them, discussing and teaching the story, teaching a new sight word, and then doing a word study activity. On day two, we are going to review the sight word that we learned the day before. So in this case, it was the word no. So I might play similar games like I played on day one where we mix up the letters. I may have them write it on their whiteboards. I may have them make it with magnet letters. And then my students are going to reread the text that we read the day before, but this time they are going to read it without my prompting. So the vocabulary should be familiar to them. Hopefully they are able to read it more fluently. And this time I might remind them of a reading strategy as they read through it a second time. So I use the book, the Reading Strategies book by Jennifer Saravallo. And this book is full of different reading strategies that you can make for your students. So I might have a strategy like this. I might say, okay, students, today we're going to really work on covering and sliding as we read our text. So if we come across a word that looks really, really long and we don't know what it is right away, we're going to take our hands and we're going to look for parts that we know, and then we're going to cover and slide. So this word, I might cover it and I might say pla, and I'm going to uncover the next part, plastic, and then I'm going to reread my sentence. The cup is plastic, okay? Whatever word I choose to model with this strategy will depend on the level of the students. And again, ideally, I could choose a word from the book that we are reading together. I also use these strategies with my students that are incorporated with animals. So I might say, okay, friends, remember chunky monkey? We need to look for chunks in our words that we know. Break the word into chunks you already know. And then at this point, I would use my magnet letters. Maybe I would say, okay, we have the word, we have the word hat. This would be for a lower level group. Really simple. What chunk of this word do we already know? Oh, at. We know the at word family. At, hat. Okay? And I would model physically breaking apart the word. And depending on my students' needs, I would have them physically break apart the words. Again, ideally, I'm going to use words from this story that they might have trouble with, that they would be useful for them to use their Chunky Monkey strategy or their cover and slide strategy, okay? So on day number 2, we review our sight words, we reread the book, and then we discuss again. We might discuss a little bit deeper. So we may look for maybe some character motivation. We may look for a lesson that the author wants us to learn. We may look for retelling the story, being able to sequence all the parts of the story. Again, that will depend on my group and it will depend on what their needs are. And then the last piece of guided reading is guided writing. And guided writing means that whatever we've discussed after rereading our text that we are super familiar with now, whatever we've discussed, we're going to write that. I like to have my students keep a notebook that I keep behind my table for when they come to my table for reading group. And they might write, the lesson in Chocolate Chip Hippo is, and I would give them that sentence frame on a whiteboard. We would discuss it. It's really a short writing prompt that they would complete after all the work that they've done with this book. And then this is the beauty of small group reading. Now my students have a book that they are familiar with, they know the vocabulary for, they have discussed the story, and now they can go and they can put this in their book box to read during independent reading time. And then their book box is full of books that they are familiar with, that they can successfully read. And this is how they are able to grow as readers, because this book was a slightly challenging book for them at their instructional level. But then once they reread it over and over, they're gaining fluency, they're gaining confidence in their decoding skills, and then this book will eventually become an independent book for them, where they can read books at this level no problem on their own. So guided reading is very useful for children with learning disabilities. It is also useful for all learners. However, children with learning disabilities should be met in a small reading group at least 4, preferably 5 times a week. So every day at school, we should be meeting with these students in small groups so that they can gain the tools and strategies that they need to be successful. Neurologically typical students in my classroom might meet with me in a guided reading group maybe 2 or 3 times a week, but I really want to reinforce my phonics and decoding and reading skills with my students with learning disabilities as much as I can.